Rewilding Europe, that's where I'm working for. So my name is Joep Van de Vlasakker. I'm the wildlife advisor of Rewilding Europe. And I understand that this meeting is about challenge, about changes. Well, Rewilding Europe wants to make changes because what's happening in Europe is that marginal agricultural areas are changing rapidly. Farmers are leaving, the young people are leaving, land is being abandoned, and we have bush encroachment. Because of the bush encroachment, we have a loss of biodiversity, and social structures are also falling apart. Schools are being closed, shops are being closed, etc. This is happening throughout Europe. It's a bad situation, so turning something negative, Rewilding Europe wants to turn it in something positive. And one of the things they want to do is bring back wildlife, because wildlife can bring tourists, and tourists can bring income and bring livelihood again back to the rural societies. And one of the species they want to bring back is bison. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So how do I move this? All right. So every time I do this, it works. So this is, so I'm going to talk about European bison. But before I'm going to talk about it, I want everybody to raise his or her hand who has never heard about the European bison, doesn't know what it is. And don't be shy, just put up your hands. This is unbelievable. This is really unbelievable. Can I? Yes, it works, great. Because last year I gave a presentation in Salamanca at a conference called Wild 10. And it was full of biologists, managers, journalists specialized in nature, etc. I asked the same question, and about 10% of that audience, so it was a really green audience, said, don't know what a bison is. Then, after my speak, there was time to give some questions, and a woman from the audience said, why didn't you manage to mention during your presentation about the population of bison in Norway? And I went like this, was quiet for a second, because I thought, how is it possible that I've been working so long on bison, I didn't know about that population? And luckily someone, a colleague who was also in the audience, saved me, because, yes, it turned out it was an aurochs population, a muskox population. So even in that audience, people confuse bison for muskox and other species. So, why is it that, and really I'm really surprised that nobody raised his hand here, really smart audience here. Because almost everybody in Europe knows American bison. Like, let's put it the other way. If I would have asked that question about, do you know European bison in Bucharest, or here on the street in Cluj, probably I got a score of 95% that never heard about the European bison, but they have heard about the American bison. Why is that? Because Hollywood. We know the buffalo from the cowboy and Indian movies. And most of you are maybe familiar with what happened to the American buffalo, to the American bison. It was killed in huge numbers. When the white man came, there was still about 16 million of bison, and 90 years later, there were only 750 left in the wild. Luckily, it survived, but it nearly escaped extinction. In Europe, there were also very high numbers of European bison, but they were hunted for a much longer time. So our decline went much more gradual than in the US, where it went really like this. So it started already in early Pleistocene, where already the Neanderthals hunted the bison, and there's a site in Maran in France, and there are bones discovered from an estimated of 6,000 European bison. So it has been hunted for a very long time, and it could only survive in very remote areas, remote forests, mountainous areas, etc. So I better keep my hands still. So, no, I like the system. It worked perfectly until I moved my hand. So, okay. So, because it was hunted so intensively, the numbers were very low. So it didn't have much impact on the landscape. And because of this intensive hunting that increased over the years, populations further dropped. And finally, it meant local extinctions first. For example, in Belgium, Germany, France, the bison became extinct in the Middle Ages. Then in Romania, your country, it happened in the 18th century. And the last bison in Bielorussia, very famous areas for its bison, was in 1919. And finally, the last one was killed in the Caucasus in 1927. So luckily, there were survivors in zoos. 45 animals survived. And of these 45, 12 passed on their genes. So after, or even before the last one was extinct in the wild, people got together and talked about this problem, and they started with the bison restitution in 1922 when they established the stud book. And they organized breeding, brought animals together, and the population grew gradually, very gradually, but there were enough species to individuals to release them again in the wild in 1952. So more reintroductions followed. So the first one was in Bielorussia, and then there were more in Poland, in other areas, in Belarus, Lithuania, Ukraine, Russia, Azerbaijan, and Slovakia in 2003. So that was a recent one. Then in Latvia in 2004. Romania, your country, in Vanatory Nyamt in 2013, and in Germany, another one in the Rothaargebirge. But it doesn't mean things are going well for the bison, because if you look at these figures, in 1990, there were 6 herds with more than 100 bison. In 2004, there were only 4 left. And in 2013, there were only 3 herds left with more than 100 bison. So there's still a lot of threats to the bison. So in the IUCN Bison Action Plan, and IUCN is an international conservation organization, it was written that the risk of extinction of the European bison, both in captivity and in the wild, is still there, and it's still very high. They identified in this IUCN Action Plan several problems related to the bison. Habitat fragmentation is one of them, which is affecting a lot of species. Isolated populations, so there's no gene exchange. So the populations are not viable, numbers are too low, and the low genetic variability. Then there are some more, but I understand during TEDx presentation you only have 18 minutes, so I have to go through it very quickly. So there are some more diseases, but I'll quickly jump to the last one, and that's poaching. Poaching is still a very big threat to the European bison, and that's why several populations became extinct again. That's why we went from first 6 populations, more than 100, to down to only 3 now. So the conclusions, after 90 years of bison restitutions, 6 years since the first reintroduction and 10 years after the IUCN Species Action Plan, we can conclude that the European bison is still a very, very threatened species. Everybody knows how threatened the black rhino is. There are still about 5,000 individuals living in the wild. If you look at the European bison, there are less than 2,700 living in the wild. So the European bison, our European animal, is more threatened than the black rhino. But who cares about it? Who hears about it? We hear nothing about it. Then, if we go to the current problems of the European bison, then one of the problems is this lack of implementation of the laws that are there to protect the European bison, and the international treaties have been made around the European bison. There is still no national bison strategy. Luckily, Romania made a strategy for the European bison, but it's really an exception, so very well done for Romania. There's still lack of international coordination for conservation. And still a lot of management is based on old techniques, so technical management. That means feeding the animals in the wintertime, for example, and culling and relocating, etc. Then the growth of the world population is still too slow. So what was identified in the IUCN action plan still holds today for most of it. And again, as the last one, I mentioned poaching and illegal hunting, and sometimes even hunting, for example, in Belarus. So the main threat is, what it all comes down to, is we do not know the animals, and therefore we do not love the animals, and therefore there's not enough support for the conservation of the species. So its role, its important ecological role, is not even recognized by the majority of the biologists and the park managers. So there's something that we really have to work on. And this is, for example, a situation how bison are managed in the wild. They're being fed, so they concentrate, and there's no positive impact within the ecosystem. The densities here is a mentioning of 5 bison per 1,000 hectares. That's a recommendation written in one of the bison plans, but 5 animals have little effect, of course, on 1,000 hectares. You need much higher numbers to really have a good impact for other species. So the bison is really an important species for nature. Because it grazes and browses, normally, which should be in large numbers, it has a very positive influence on the landscape. It keeps the landscape open, it keeps the landscape varied, etc. And it not only grazes and browses, it wallows, it tramples, it fertilizes, all that benefits plant species and other animal species. And of course, it has an important role as a food source for other species. For example, wolves. If numbers of bison are high enough, then wolves can hunt them. And of course, scavengers will then eat for what's left over. So you can really say it's really a key species of nature. And it's also an umbrella species, because if you protect the bison and its habitat, a lot of species under that protection umbrella will also be protected. So what can Rewilding Europe do about it? What wants Rewilding Europe do about it? Well, first of all, I think it's important to mention that Rewilding Europe has 3 important elements. One is, of course, the conservation element. Another one is the mass communication. We want to reach out to the audience, that they know more about what's happening in nature, that it's very important to protect these key species. But it also wants to reach out to mass communication by attracting tourists to these areas, so they will come to these areas and leave money, which is very important for the local society, the local community. So it's also concentrating on business development. It's in these areas, in these rural areas, Rewilding Europe wants to help local people build up their business around bison conservation. There can be bison watching, etc. So we wrote a Rewilding action plan that will be presented in May here in Romania. And we want to have several bison projects throughout Europe in several of our rewilding areas. In total, we want to establish 10 rewilding areas, and in minimum 5 of those we want to have bison projects and either help the existing population or bring back bison if they no longer exist. So we have quite a new approach, different than most other reintroduction projects. And excuse me, I just need a sip of coffee, not to stay awake, but just my throat is getting a little bit dry. So we have a bit of a different approach. What happened in the past that bison were released, sometimes first kept sometimes a longer time in captivity and then released into the wild. And that was it. Then maybe some damages occurred, and sometimes something was done about it, sometimes not. If there was damage, then sometimes they were relocated, etc. But they didn't really work hard enough to really have a good follow-up. And that's something that we want to do. We want to give the project a good follow-up. So we just don't want to bring this year some bison. We want to bring every year bison to really build up the population fast. Because if you remember one of the slides, we only have 3 populations with more than 100 individuals. So we want to build up very fast several populations that are also over 100 of individuals. And we wanted to do it without additional feeding, because we want the bison to spread in the area, not be concentrated around feeding sites, but move in the ecosystem and have a good positive influence on other species and really have an impact on the landscape. So we keep those areas which are now being left by farmers with their sheep, their goats, etc., which are, you have the bush encroachment, reforestation. We want these areas to be varied, nice, mosaic type of landscapes. So what are the best opportunities for bison? Bison specialist has identified the Carpathians as the most suitable area to do this. And in the Carpathians there are historical connections with the bison. Several towns are still named after the bison, etc. So our first project is in the Taku Mountains in very close to Karan Sabesh, which you can see on the map. And it was identified as a very suitable area for reasons of habitat. The habitat was very good, and also because of local support from local authorities, local people. So what we will do, we will bring bison to this area. First, bring them to an acclimatization zone of about 15 hectares where they can recover from the transport, etc., because they will come from different countries. And they'll still be fed. And then they'll move later in the summer to an area, we call it a rewilding zone, of more than 150 hectares, where they will learn a life independent in nature, because some of these animals will come from zoos, some will come from larger bison reserve, but they really have to learn to live independent in nature again, without assistance from mankind. And these areas can already be visited by tourists. So we want to start right from the beginning from the project. We want to help local businesses around tourism to watch this animal. So our goal is to have in the year 2025 at least 350 bison in this area. So, as I mentioned before, we need these large numbers for species conservation, for biodiversity purposes, and also social-economic development. Because if you have only 10 bison, it won't attract much tourists. But if you have lots of bison, it can attract a lot of tourists, and that means a lot of businesses around this can blossom. So the first bison are planned to arrive on the 17th of May. 18, maybe a few more. Let's hope so. We already started with training the local people, and it was very interesting to see there's a lot of interest from these young people to really stay in the area and have a job in guiding tourists for this purpose. So, to summarize, there are 4 important reasons to bring back the bison to Southern Carpathian, to the Taku Mountains. One of them is it's a very threatened species. So we have an international responsibility to do something about it. Secondly, it's a very important species for biodiversity. If you protect the bison, a lot of other species will be protected. Thirdly, it can really help the social development of these rural areas. I mean, social economic development of this area. And as a 4th reason, just because it's a very, very beautiful animal. And I think we should be proud of this animal. If you look at animals, if you compare them, the American animals and the European animals, every animal in America is bigger, as everything is bigger and better in America. The beaver is bigger, the moose is bigger, the elk is bigger, but our bison is bigger than the American bison. So we should be proud of that. So, I want to ask you all to join us in helping bringing back home the bison to the Southern Carpathian. So thank you very much.